So it's a dispersed crowd this morning. Mic may be a little hot. We can turn it down just a hair. Thank you guys for coming out. This has been a great conference so far for me. I showed up today. It may still be a little hot there. Had a wonderful welcome. Richmond is a very welcoming city. If anybody wants to come down closer, please feel free to. It's kind of lonely up here, and it's just me and Jeremy, so feel free to come down. I do like to keep my talks conversational. That's where I find the most value comes from conference talks, because nobody was probably coming for this talk, but if you hear something in this talk because you needed somewhere to sit for an hour, that's kind of what I hope you get out of this. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about, was I supposed to mix the security in or bake it, was I supposed to mix it in before I bake it? And really what I do, I'm an independent consultant. I've been on my own for about 5 weeks now. And what I see happening is we use a lot of cliches in the industry. And we don't really know what they mean, and people use them incorrectly. So this is really a talk to kind of unpack those things, help people understand what these cliches mean and deconstruct it so that we can rebuild it in a useful pattern. So just so you know what to expect over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to do an introduction, talk a little bit about background and overview. I'll go through that quickly. I'm going to unpack the security versus business tension. We all know it's there, but sometimes I think it's hard to articulate it, and nobody's really figured out a way to navigate it well. So I want to unpack that and generate some conversation there. Also, coming back to a balance, right? When things get out of balance, they don't work well. And then we'll talk about some architectural solutions and a real kind of accountability moment for security practitioners. What is it that we can do to make this situation better? And then we'll have time for questions at the end. Unless we have questions throughout, please feel free to raise your hand, wave at me. Again, I like to keep this conversational. I also want to thank RVAsec. This is great facilities. This is a great, just a great welcoming environment. So thank you guys for making it so welcoming. I'll go ahead and get started. Just a quick introduction. So a little bit about me. I am a Christian. I learned to talk in front of people in middle school Sunday school class. They can't leave because their parents make them sit there, so I kind of got a lot of practice there. I'm a father of 3. I'm also used to being able to make people sit and listen to me. That's great. I've been an independent security consultant only about 5 weeks. I don't have a website. I don't have business cards yet, so I have some personal ones if you'd like to have a conversation, if there's something I can help with. If you need another talk, I'm really interested in giving back to the community at this point in my business. I was raised in a barn, and a lot of people laugh, like, what do you mean raised in a barn? My wife says, you weren't raised in a barn. I was like, no, I really was, and she's seen the barn I was raised in. But the reason I like to bring that cliche at this point, when people hear that, the expression is you don't know how to close the doors, right? And that cliche just does not work, because if you were actually raised in a barn, you know that if you don't close the door, the horses get out and the cows get in, and you have a mess. So you learn that lesson really quickly growing up in the country, in a barn. So that's kind of what started my whole thing. Like, we need to take apart, back to first principles, what it is that we're talking about when we're talking security, and then we can start building from there. So I do have some creds. I've earned those over the last couple years. Every one was fun, and I recommend all those highly. Just a quick disclaimer. So anything I say is me. It doesn't necessarily reflect anybody else, or may not even be good security advice. So take it, put it in your context and analyze it before you do anything that I say. On into background and overview. So what is the problem that I'm talking about today? So good security requires planning. It requires preparation, right? That immediately leads into time, right? I've got to have time to do those things. And as a result of needing that time, I'm going to delay the project. Inevitably, somebody is going to be upset because of this security requirement. I can't meet it. It's got to have an exception. There's a documentation process that's going to follow. All of those things, we have to work through them. But businesses need projects to stay in business, right? If you're not growing as a business, your competition is, and they're coming after your revenue stream. Like, let's just get down to brass tacks. Everyone who's in the space with you is coming after your revenue stream. Everyone benefits from healthy competition, but we need projects to do that. And so business wants the results. They want the return on investment. Security wants the confidentiality, integrity, availability, right? All of those things that we have to provide. Well, now we collide, right? Now we have tension that we have to come back and balance. So what are the goals of this talk? So I want to explore that tension, And I also want to review some real-world balance failures. When things get out of balance, this is what I want to show you what it looks like and just kind of go through those in sequence and kind of, okay, this is what it means to fail. There's a couple architectures that worked and a couple that don't. These are going to be very old-school architecture, so it's not going to be highly technical, but I think it will paint a picture of how architecture can help solve this problem. And then I want to redefine the security practitioner's role. All right, security versus business. The reality, business people struggle with security, technical people struggle with security, and then security people struggle with both sides, right? The security person has to make sure they have their availability on that CIA triad. They also have to make sure they maintain confidentiality and integrity. And if we don't do those things, the security guy is the one that's going to have the uncomfortable conversation. So they're acutely aware of what they have to do to maintain all these pieces, right? It turns into an epic battle. So what is a security requirement, right? We're not really good at writing these things down. So business people are focused on planned functionality. What is it I want the system to do? And really, security requirements are almost negative requirements. And what should it not do, right? It should keep the hackers out. Don't let the hackers in becomes that negative requirement that we have to define, right? And I've worked with customers that was their requirement. It was actually not the hackers, it was the penetration tester, because if the penetration tester got in, it was their job on the line. So that becomes a security requirement. Even if that penetration tester did not reflect the risk of that organization. So maintain compliance or other regulator satisfaction, right? That is a big deal. If you cannot keep your regulators satisfied, you're not in business. So that one becomes a little bit easier to define. And a lot of times regulators, PCI, NERC, they put requirements together that, okay, now at least I know what we're talking about. I can aim for something, right? Train developers on secure coding practice. That's a standard PCI requirement. Like, okay, I get it. How good is that control? Right? It's administrative. I've trained them. Are they actually going to go out and do it? Do they understand in context what it means to do? All right, sanitize untrusted inputs. That's clear, but what does that mean, right? The penetration tester is going to tell you have to whitelist everything that you allow in your application. And then you say, well, wait a minute, it's a free form. So we start exploring that balance again. A lot of times you'll see this in projects. All right, we're going to do a security assessment. Maybe it's a vulnerability scan. Maybe it is a penetration test. But the outcome is we don't have any high or critical findings. That's what we're looking for. As long as we don't have high or critical findings, ship it to production, right? Good organizations come back from moderates and lows, but a lot of people don't have time, right? At that point, the business priority is turn this into return on investment. All right, so what does the business requirement look like? Calculate interest on a loan. That seems, okay, yeah, that's easy. Everybody learns that in 7th grade until you find out how complicated calculating interest on a loan can be. Oh, the interest rate changes. Oh, the interest rate can't go above a certain amount. Oh, the interest rate can't change so much in so much time. All of the complexity that we introduce comes into these business requirements, right? Sometimes this is one that I recently found, sending a purchase order electronically. Seems pretty easy, right? Like we get a file format and then you realize, oh, there's this whole electronic data interchange culture and it's a niche field. There's really specialized things that happen in it and you're like, who knew this was so complicated, right? But that is the business requirement, automating the disbursement process. That sounds great, right? I don't want somebody to have to cut checks. The security person freaks out at this point, like, wait, they're going to automate the way money leaves the account? That sounds like a terrible idea. Right? That we have to work through that. And I love timelines, right? Complete the first sprint by February 28th. Just a nominal timeline, but what is the first sprint, right? We don't even know sometimes in the sprint scope, right? The activities that we're going to do to achieve this date are going to change, right? But we know we got to have a sprint by February 28th. So what are technical requirements in? And this is the business track. I'm not going to really dive in, but I want to make sure everyone in the room has a concept of what that technical voice in the conversation, the problem they have to solve for. So response latency, less than 2 seconds. If you've watched a millennial use a mobile device, if they don't have what they expected from the device in 2 seconds, they're gone to another app, right? That becomes tremendously important to have things fast in modern applications. It has to be testable. Okay, well that sounds good, but what do we mean by testable? I can certainly put a button, a seat, to go through and run through test scripts and make sure everything's working the way it should. Do I also mean that it should be penetration testable? Talk to somebody that has a critical production application with no development or test environment. All of a sudden, I can't run penetration tests, or I can't run a good penetration test because I have to worry about impacting my customers, right? Network throughput of a service level agreement, right? These are the kind of technical requirements that we have to solve for. All right, so what's the result, right? It took me 4 slides to get here, but this is what we have. The CFO, he wants his results yesterday. The CIO wants to meet his SLA, keep everything running. And the CISO, right, the Chief Information Security Officer, he wants to dot his I's and cross his T's, right? He's got the compliance burden. He's got the risk, right? He's really our risk manager in the equation. And what that really turns into is everybody's comfortable with this because, oh, well, this is the CISO's problem. I just want my CFO wants results, CTO wants his SLA met, so he looks good at the end of the year, and the CISO becomes the chief scapegoat. That's what really happens. Wonder why the average tenure of a CISO is 18 months. Right? It's hard work, and they're going to get pushed on all sides to get it all done, and try not to compromise their integrity and deliver a secure solution. So let's talk about that balance. What happens when security overpowers business, right? This is a great story. I've got the links in the show notes. I'll publish those later. But the German basketball team gets pushed down from the pro league to the secondary league because of a delay of game. So the scoreboard laptop had to patch. You guys remember a year ago, Microsoft didn't give you much choice in when you were going to patch. It didn't matter if you were in a Skype meeting. It was time to patch, right? So security winning over business isn't good either. This one happened to me this year. It's a user can't change their password. You're like, come on, dude, how do you not change your password? Well, they gave me the requirements, and I used one of my password schemes that I thought, this is a great password scheme. And it didn't work. Active Directory wouldn't accept the password. And I was like, okay, let me try this. I took the password to the systems engineer. I said, hey, can you tell me what I'm missing here? He looked at it. He's like, no, I really can't. Use this one, right? And all of a sudden, we're kind of back in that loop of everything that they had tried to accomplish with making a rigid password requirement policy was gone. GrooveShark 2015. This is kind of a sideways example because they're hard to find good ones of this, right? Usually when security kills something, you never hear about it. It never makes it through the startup phase. GrooveShark got out there. Anybody ever in here listen to GrooveShark? No, it was great. Like instead of it was before all of the music you wanted to hear was on YouTube. I don't know how they do it, but you could type in the name of the song you wanted and it would play. Unlike Pandora, where you kind of have to listen and it's more like a radio station. Well, GrooveShark stood up, raised $6 million, and then all of a sudden the royalty company started coming to them. It was like, hey, you got to pay for these songs, and they're like, wait, what? And so they tried to work out agreements to pay for the songs, but at the end they couldn't, and everyone just started suing them, and they just dissolved. So it's like, okay, we got to be careful about that. And that's just an illustration of, we hear about that one, it's one you may have heard of, but startups just can't get off the ground because of the security implications, right? And we hear that constant tension, time to market. If I'm not first to market, it's not going to matter. So so security becomes the easy compromise. What happens when business overpowers security? We see things like the Mirai botnet, right? Everyone hears that one. And that's what happens when you're first to market and you don't have a security posture that you're trying to maintain. You're just trying to get it to market, figure out the security later. Okay, well now we have this botnet floating around the interwebs. Target's heating and cooling system introduction to their breach, right? Very reasonable business requirement. If that store is not at a comfortable temperature, people aren't buying their products. So it was a necessary business requirement to have those people in the environment. But when the security posture doesn't isolate the payment cards from the payment cards from the HVAC, now we have a real problem, right? It takes time and energy to segment those things, do it well, and keep everything running. So I use Hillary Clinton's email server, not because it's of political interest to me, but rather because it's an illustration of what happens when security becomes so rigid. She couldn't do what she needed to do with her DoD email, or at least that was her perception. And at the end of that, she stands up her own email server. She wasn't using Yahoo. It wasn't like she was pushing secrets through Yahoo. But now she has her own service because that was easier than fixing the DoD's email solution. All right, so balance. This is where I think we get it wrong as security practitioners. If we separate security and risk and we don't acknowledge that everything that we are doing in that confidentiality, integrity, availability space isn't directly tied back to risk, we're missing it, right? Context. We so often underappreciate context. And what I mean by that, there is a difference between a vulnerability on Adobe Acrobat on a user workstation and a server, right? Just the use cases of those two, same application but different context. One has a significantly lower, specifically that server has a lower risk because nobody's using Adobe Acrobat on the server. It just got installed there because that was in the build, right? Those are the kind of things that if we don't keep that context in the forefront of our approach, we will have engineers chasing vulnerabilities that are not going to keep us from getting breached. And then healthy discourse is difficult. How many people have seen a Twitter storm or a Facebook argument and it's like, wow, that's no way to live, right? Yeah, like that's a real problem. Like we can't even have a healthy conversation anymore because it has to be me and you, us and them. Like if you don't agree with me on this, then everything else about you must be wrong and I'm coming at you personally. And that's almost become part of our culture and expected. You can almost know when you go to Facebook, you're going to see some nasty back and forth. It's like, is that what our society has become? All right, so let's talk architecture for a minute. No, we're good. Let's talk architecture for a minute. So TCP/IP, this is one of the foundations of the internet. This is how all the data moves around, right? Designed in the 70s, adopted in the 80s, right? It took 10 years from the design to adoption. It didn't get secured until the 90s. 1994 is when Netscape started introducing SSL at that point. And now, once we have SSL and everybody feels good about the confidentiality and integrity piece, we find ourselves with the guys that did this back in the 70s have now paved the way for Paris Hilton to become a household name, right? Paris Hilton isn't who she is without TCP/IP. And we forget that, right? Because it's just in the background. It's this beautiful architecture that accommodated security. It had bolt holes where they needed to be. Let's go to a different architecture, right? So DNS, right? Same fundamental, it's a different layer of the OSI stack, but it's still the same fundamental concept of this is how we move information on the internet, right? It's the phone book of the internet. Well, this was proposed in '83 and it's been essential since 1985. That kind of gives you a timeline of when people are actually getting on the interwebs, looking at websites. It was designed for 50 million addresses and there's 271 now. So, wow, kudos to, I got the guy's name that did it. Kudos to Paul Makapetras for designing a system that could scale to that level. And it is fast. However, we haven't secured DNS yet. Like, we've tried. But if you look at the adoption, 25% in the US right now is actually using secured DNS. And the problem is UDP, the protocol equivalent of TCP/IP, it doesn't have the same back and forth validation, right? So even though it was a simple authentication of, I'm going to send you something, you send it back to me, and I know I'm bidirectional now, and I'm talking to the same device, DNS doesn't require that. We introduced race conditions, we introduced all kinds of poisoning attacks, and we've solved the problem, but guess what? Nobody's really interested in fixing it. I just want to get to the Twitters and the YouTubes. All right, so what do we learn from all this? It is really hard to bolt on if you don't have bolt holes before you start, right? Some controls, right, remember TCP/IP? They had bolt holes everywhere so that you just slide into this layer, you slide into this layer, and this is what you're doing. It was clear and everyone could follow it. But forecasting unexpected use cases is hard, right? When Paul Makapetras is building DNS, he had no idea that people would want to, or he didn't, I don't think he imagined people would want to maliciously point people to other websites to abuse them, right? That wasn't part of the original design, right? So we have to have those bolt holes. Because if we don't, imagine we had, remember that timeline back from the TCP/IP. Imagine we had said, no, we're not going to roll out until we're secure. Well, the collaboration that occurred between 1970 and 1994, I think it was 73, that collaboration couldn't have happened, and we wouldn't even, we never would have paved the way for Paris Hilton, right? So as disappointing as that would be, there's lots of other really good things that we wouldn't have because we made a compromise. We said, we've got the bolt holes, let's go forward with this and put the security in once we have time, right? The bad news is security can take years because we haven't thought through all of the things that we have to think through up front. It's hard. All right, so how do we improve security, right? So there's a couple trends that are happening in the industry now that are really good and have a really good shot of helping us prepare, right? So containers. This whole concept, so a container is kind of like a virtual machine light, except imagine this, it's immutable, right? You don't patch a container, you rebuild the container and publish it again, right? So now it's a very different paradigm, but I now have patching built in all the way back into my software development lifecycle, which sounds good as long as you maintain an active software development lifecycle. If we don't use this technology correctly, we're going to have stale containers that we can't patch, and no one has the build process anymore. Now we have even bigger problems. We also have this amazing capacity now because that container is really just a description of an operating system, less than it is just an operating system itself. It builds an operating system, but we really start with this description, and that description becomes auditable. I can look at the versions, I can look at the configuration, the settings, everything that's been applied to that container is now in code. And when it changes, I have a change history versus today I have a systems engineer that has to go in, adjust something on the system itself, and then it's probably not documented, it's forgotten, and we forget that we've now created a vulnerability based on the new configuration to keep the application running, right? DevSecOps is another trend that we see right now. So if you imagine building in security testing throughout the software development lifecycle. I read a stat this week, 338% more likely to include security across the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, if you're doing DevSecOps. Why? Because it's automated, right? We put static application scanning right there on the developer's workstation. So if he writes a piece that's vulnerable, he gets a little red flag. It's like, I should look at that. Right? We also have dynamic application scanning. So I get that build, and it's just part of, I push the button because I want to get it one step closer to release. There, it's off in the test environment, and automated test scripts immediately start running against that. Right? Now, if I don't update my test scripts for the new functionality I'm adding, I haven't really added value. Right? But these tools are going to give, these trends give me the option, give me the opportunity to fix these things where I'm at now, right? Another really interesting thing that's happening right now is software frameworks. It used to not be a thing, right? Frankly, when I started coding in 2002, it really wasn't a thing that you had frameworks. You had languages, and that was great, and you were delighted. And then they had modules. But with frameworks, we're starting to see big security improvements. And the one example that I love to use is cross-site request forgery. And it actually fell out of the OWASP top 10. So the top 10 vulnerabilities being discovered in web applications today, cross-site request forgery, not cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery fell out of the top 10. Why? Because frameworks are taking care of that for developers. Developers are building on top of already existing code that's been vetted and tested. Now, if those last two things aren't true, if I haven't vetted and tested the code that I'm pushing into my application, I've created a new problem. If I don't secure the layers that I've had to add to put containers in, my Kubernetes layer, my Docker's layer, whatever is running that container, I've now created new vulnerabilities that I have to defend against, right? So this can't be just run in, quickly do it. We're back to that required planning and required planning and architecture to make these things work well. All right, security practitioners. How many people in here count themselves a security practitioner? Okay, lights are bright, but I saw probably 15 hands out of 40 people. That's great. All right, so this is the thing that we have to acknowledge about ourselves, right? This is how our partners perceive us, right? we just say no. A security guy, and I'm not saying this is you, right? But I've been before. So I see some chuckles back there. Maybe it is you. As I went through lots of different organizations, I used to manage a team of penetration testers, and that was the impression that most of the business people had about their security and compliance people. Was they were just always saying no. We abuse FUD, right? We like to talk about FUD, but we ourselves use it, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's sometimes, the unfortunate part is that's the only thing that seems to connect with our audience. And the salespeople have realized this. They leverage it heavily. And we find ourselves like, how do I convey risk without FUD, right? The worst thing that we can do is overstating risk. And I'll give you an example of this. So when I'm working with penetration testers, and they have this absolutely amazing hack that they pulled off in a penetration test. They're so excited about it. It was very difficult. And you know what? Can anybody guess what the first draft of the report comes back with the severity of that finding is? Critical. Yeah, like this is the most dangerous thing ever. Why? Because they want it on the top of the report, right? I get it. Beautiful work, amazing work. It's not that I want to hide it in the middle or back, but it is to say, yeah, that's some really good stuff, and they gave you 3 legs up. They put you on the network. They did whatever other accommodations they gave you. Is the likelihood really very high to say it's a critical? Probably not. That's hard for us when we get excited about vulnerabilities, when there's something new in the news. Our initial response is, we got to deal with that. It's like, wait, hold on. Poodle's bad, but it may not be the end of the world. We need to understand what it is, how it gets abused. Is it an interest in my context? Am I protecting the secret recipe for peanut butter and banana sandwiches? Am I preparing for, or am I protecting against national secrets? Two very different contexts. All right, we slow down and delay projects, and this is probably one of the most dangerous things for us. So information security, my assessment, is the liberal arts of technology, right? We have all of the compliance obligations, we have all of the technical pieces we have to understand. We have to really, if we're doing our jobs well, we have to be playing middleman for the business and technology as well to keep that availability, right? So I need the feature, get it in. We have to be doing all of those things. And if we only understand network security and we don't understand all of the other application controls that may be there that protect this application, we do ourselves a disservice. So what does ideals look like? The first one up here is a consultant's trick, right? You never hear, if you watch consultants, they don't like to use the word but, because it signals to the person listening, see a laugh, it signals to the person listening that whatever you just said, no, I'm going this way. But if you say yes and, all of a sudden you've built rapport with the person, and they're ready to come with you. Oh, he's agreeing with me, and he's just going to go a little step further. I can live with that, right? Trust, assurance, and confidence, right? That's the opposite of FUD. How do we establish these things, right? And if you look at some of the things that I'm going to talk about, it'll come back, and I'm going to put a pin on that one. We have to understand enough background to be helpful. It's impossible to be a world-class practitioner in network security, storage security, identity and access management, all of those pieces, because there are specific tools, right, in each one that you have to know, and there's nuances to each of those tools. There's overlaps, and there's a lot of information to know. But what we have to do as general practitioners is understand enough about those pieces to understand how they play together and how they work in concert to protect the application. Right? We have to paint accurate risk pictures, right? That is hard. Expressing likelihood of something that we've never seen before is hard. And I want to jump right to this one, right? We don't accept risk. This is where I think most security practitioners go home exhausted every day because they're carrying the risk of the organization on their shoulders. And that's not the way the security practitioner is designed to be. The security practitioner is the voice. They're there to educate the business, right? The executives or the senior leadership, whatever level is making the decision. They're there to educate, but at the end of the day, the business has to accept that risk, not the security practitioner. So if the security practitioner doesn't do a good job, right? If they don't do a good job, the business person doesn't understand the risk, and there's risk on the table. Does that mean you're going to get breached? Maybe not, Remember, we're working on likelihoods in security, and we forget that. We just see vulnerability, we have to patch it because it's going to be our risk, our job, if we don't convey the risk appropriately, right? This is the biggest thing that I think security people can do that they don't realize they can do, right? Because you become the liberal arts of technology, and you have all these pieces. You're interacting with business, technology, compliance. As a security practitioner, if you're able to connect the silos, you accelerate projects. How much better does that feel than the guy that's slowing the project down? If people want you on your project because of your relationships, your confidence with the organization, the controls, and the people to navigate the project methodology successfully. All right, and here's another harsh reality. It's hard to find good help. We can't all be the best at everything, right? We look at the trend of stack consolidation, right? Full stack developers. I want you to know all the things. I want you to know the database, the networking, the operating system, the application code, everything else that I threw in there. You've got to know it, right? So we can't all be the best. The other thing that I don't think anyone wants to admit in our industry is you can't educate to competence. And what I mean by that is I can't go to a boot camp and come back and be a security practitioner. I just can't. Like, you have to have your hands on it. You have to see it. You have to understand how the pieces are putting together, what's happening. You probably even have to try to break it one time to make sure you've actually achieved least privilege. Information security, risk analysis, all of these pieces in the last bullet down there, those are the things that we have to converge as practitioners to help the business achieve their goals. If we don't, if we're deficient on any of those, and the business needs it, now we are the brakes, right? We need to be the entity that helps them achieve their goals, right? So the talent gap. How many people have been victims of the talent gap this year? Okay, how many people are hiring managers? Okay, good. So 3 or 4 hiring managers in the group, well, I saw one hand that said they'd been victim to the talent gap. Trying to hire penetration testers, it was almost impossible to find certified and conversational penetration testers, right? This is not a new problem. So for me, I graduated college in 2002 and I went to work in the steel industry. Like, what did you do in the steel industry? It's the best training I had. I worked in every single job in the steel mill. I started day one pushing scrap cars around with a railroad mover. Absolutely amazing. I worked on the furnace. I drove the cranes. They actually didn't let me drive the cranes, but I did work the little baby furnace one night, right? I worked in every single job in that mill until I understood it. And the problem the steel industry was solving is they could not get good engineers to come work in steel mills because of the reputation of a steel mill. And instead, what they gave me was a tremendous amount of value. I was now able to learn how the business works, because after all of that operational work, I went through HR and finance and shipping. So I followed that scrap in all the way out and through every supplemental process that made that mill work. Imagine we train people that way to understand how pieces fit together, right? Job rotation, right? This is the hard part. You get really good at something, what's your manager want to do? Just keep doing it, right? They don't want to move you around because that means they got to train somebody else, and that's going to be hard, especially when they're trying to meet all of the timelines and expectations of the business, right? But if we're thinking long term, that job rotation, even if it's a mini version of the security associate programs, those are going to help us in the long run be able to connect the pieces together. Again, back to that liberal arts of technology being security. Certification is a very dangerous thing. How many people in the room know what a paper tiger is? Yeah, they're real, right? So if you've ever talked to someone that has a string of certs, there's one of two outcomes. They are absolutely amazing, or 2, they're really good at taking tests. And my experience, the people that are really good at taking tests are not necessarily good at being practitioners, right? Understanding the problems and addressing them. So we have to be careful with certification. If it doesn't get coupled with hands-on and with experience, it's a very dangerous thing to hire on certifications. There's a growing trend of people that have the certifications and can't get hired. And there's a disparity between the hiring manager's expectation that I need somebody that can do all the things, liberal arts, and I really don't want to pay for that. It took me a long time to learn everything that I learned in the steel mill. That was so much more, I could add so much more value as a result of their investment. But without the investment, I really was zero value to that steel mill. All right. Mentoring is another great thing. You will hear lots of talks about just mentoring, how to do that. One thing that I want to challenge about mentoring, it doesn't have to be this ongoing, formal, once a month you meet, and I go through this process, and on the other side, I'm going to come out having been mentored and ready for my next job role. That's not really how we should be looking at mentoring. Instead, that's the same as that paper tiger. Like, no, the mentoring thing is, when you have a question, have somebody you can go and ask, right? It doesn't have to be a regular. You need to build a relationship. I don't want to undermine the value of building relationships with people and understanding it, but the real value of that is being able to go ask questions, get an outside perspective, and then act on it, right? I'm a big complainer about cybersecurity education. I've talked to several people, none from RVA, that have graduated with cybersecurity degrees and cannot articulate the basics of the CIS Top 20 to me. Not just they haven't heard of the CIS Top 20, but they can't articulate what application whitelisting is or what network access control is. If you're in a degree program and you're not conversational about the things you're getting a degree in, you probably need to reevaluate your school. And you probably need to have a conversation with someone to figure out, is it a you problem or a school problem? And fix whichever one it is, or you're not going to be productive when you get into the workforce. Sales and presentation skills. I think as an engineer, this was never really important to us, right? What we had instead was, you go learn all these technical things, and as a result, we have this army of technical capacity that can't articulate in business or otherwise terms what needs to happen to fix a problem. That concept of selling the idea. And that is a thing that I think we need to include that, not only in our academic institutions, but in our corporations. Like, how do we help people convey ideas? If we can help them get the ideas out of their heads, the organization is going to benefit tremendously. All right. You guys have been gracious. You have listened to me yammer on here for a while. What questions do you have? How many people stayed awake through the whole thing? Okay, we got some. All right, we got some. Good, good. Did you disagree with anything I said? Do you think I understated anything or overstated anything? Like, yeah, I just don't see it that way, dude. Got one. How's my mic? Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, make sure everybody heard it, how do you get developer buy-in for automated tools when there's a high false positive rate? Really good question. So what I found, so when I was a developer at one of the big banks many years ago, I don't like saying that anymore, but it's becoming true. And what I found was, if I could, with the automated testing, it wasn't advanced back then. I actually did my own automated testing at that point, because that was the tools I had. It was a bank. They weren't going to buy anything else. So what it did for me is, by the time I released my code, there were no defects. I had one of the best defects rates because I had automated testing running through every time I made a change and had a regression bug risk. How do I deal with that false positive? If we will invest the time up front to clear all the noise out, right? It takes some time. I'm not saying that it's going to be a panacea, but if you take the time to clear out, maybe you flag the code, like, I know this is here, it's not a vulnerability, it's been in the penetration test, it's been validated in the penetration test or whatever, and you have a clean scan, that's like a dopamine rush for a developer. For the kind of developer that I am anyway, when I get a report back and I missed a space one time, it's like, I got to get that space. I want that code clean, and I want zero things reporting that I haven't acknowledged are going to be things. If I don't care about spacing, fine. Turn the space flag off so that I don't get false positives because I don't care about spacing. But everything else, if I can get through that huge list that first time, or if I at least work through it, it's an amazing rush for a developer to have a clean bill come back. And I think that's how you have to sell it to them is, now the hardest part is getting the time to do that. Because normally that developer's under time pressure, doesn't have the luxury I had at the big bank to develop my own automated test scheme to get all the stuff cleaned out, and so he would know. Did that get your question? Yeah. Another question. I love shameless plugs. Uh-huh.
And we have a less than 5% false positive rate. And so that is one way to address it, but you're never going to totally get rid of this false positive. And all the entire process you talked about kind of integrating it into the SDLC and making sure that it's seamless for developers and making sure that you're not causing more conflict between security and development is always a very big challenge. DevSecOps and all that.
Yep.
So that's something we help address. Yeah.
And that's a great point. There is technology that's improving that false positive rate. There's always going to be that need for a developer to go through. And there's probably, I'm guessing you guys would also recommend a second check, right? Like, so I've got static, and you need dynamic, and you guys do both, which is beautiful. And then I like another one at the end. I like that penetration test at the end. Okay. Say more about that. Can everybody hear him? You guys can hear up at the front? Okay, go ahead. Software component. Composition.
You're looking at all of the third-party, open-source code that you didn't write, and you want to make sure there aren't vulnerabilities in what you're including in your application. So that's what they're thinking.
Great. Great point. Yes, sir.
I can't speak to results, so we've just implemented Veracode, but instead of afflicting it directly onto the development teams first, our enterprise architect has taken that on, and so they're going through the existing code base and understanding the tool. The idea behind that is that once they get it and kind of see where some of the flaws are and false positives, then when we roll it out to a development team, there's some inside information already. So I don't know if this is going to work.
Did everybody hear that story? Did everybody up there hear the story? Great story. The quick summary is you have enterprise architect. I claim he's acting as a security practitioner there. He's going to go through and weed out false positives. He's going to come through and make sure this tool is going to be useful for the team that has to use it. That's another great way to get buy-in. And right, you're not throwing it over the fence. Like, listen, there's false positive in here, but hey, can you look at these three? That's the value add that a security practitioner can provide. And if they don't, now you just have this business over here, technology over here, and security's probably left out of the conversation. Yes.
So when you've got a kind of a cultural change in the organization and you go away from an on-premise, build my Java app and it's on a server, and to a SaaS solution for your application and platform development, how do you deal with maybe hypothetically an IT organization that doesn't really know what to do? They're just like, it's like a deer in the headlights. Has anybody seen this? Because it's like, well, it's an application. Why would I do SDLM in this environment? Has anybody ever seen that happen, hypothetically? And what would you do to at the highest level, at the CTO level, say, hey, how do you bake it in now that we have this rapid way of developing, say you're going from a waterfall environment into this DevOps type of agile, and there really isn't that type of culture in the organization?
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
So my advice there is sustainable small, right? So back to the whole, and this is a great example of how to use those bolt holes. You may not have a robust dynamic or static scanning implementation, but have the bolt holes there to do it, right? And maybe it's not doing a lot. Maybe it's what you said, it's not even giving all the results out. Somebody's filtering them. But sustainable small to help them get used to that. Now, you also mentioned like software as a service, and like what do you do with that? And the piece that I'll add there, that's a lot about vendor management. Like, how do I know that I have a good vendor that I can trust, right? And there's a couple questions that I like to ask when we start talking like, okay, I'm going to give you this part of my business because it's advantageous. Well, okay, what happens if you go out of business? Have I wrapped my processes around your, and I've got to watch my time. How am I doing, Jeremy? 5 minutes. Okay, good. So I've wrapped my processes around your software as a service. You're not there, right? Or I've had you build me a custom software as a service, and now you're gone. And remember that container that I told you was immutable? I can't even patch it without your build process. Now I have another problem. So I'm afraid I'm tangential to your question. Does anybody else in the room have anecdotes or experiences they're willing to share for, yeah?
One thing that I would recommend is to basically show them the benefits of how cloud can solve some pain points that currently exist on premise. And you've been trying to solve this problem a certain way for 5 or 10 years. Well, here is a much easier way to do it. So show them all the benefits, and then that kind of makes that retooling a little bit easier because they can see how a cloud and a more agile development process makes their life easier, and they can accept some of the changes that go along with that.
That's good. Anybody else? All right, I am approaching the end of my time. I will be around. If you have any questions, love to chat with you. Come by. I'll be probably out in the hall or something, but I would love to chat. Thank you so much for coming. Had a great time with you guys today.